As she watched Yimisi step out of the car and look around, Oyibo's heart filled with bitterness. She couldn't shake the suspicion she had about this girl. Her son was so taken with. "Look at her," she murmured under her breath, her eyes narrowing. "See the way she's gawking at everything. Gold digger," she hissed, her mind filled with mistrust. When Nnamdi placed a comforting hand over Yemisi's shoulder, Oyibo's heart tightened with jealousy and anger. The sight of her son showing such affection to another woman was almost too much for her to bear. Once upon a time, in the lively and colorful city of Lagos, which is found in the western parts of Nigeria, there was a very rich and well-known family called the Kanu family. Even though they originally came from the eastern parts of Nigeria, Mr. Kalu, the head of the family, was famous for his hard work and success. He was involved in many different kinds of businesses and did very well in all of them. Because of his success, he owned several companies, many beautiful houses, and a collection of fancy cars. But Mr. Kalu was not just rich, he was also a very generous and caring person. He helped the people in his city a lot and was always willing to lend a hand to those in need. Because of his kindness and generosity, everyone in the community loved and respected him. In fact, he was so well regarded that almost no important decision in the community was made without asking for his advice and opinion. Mr. Kalu's influence and contributions made him a beloved figure in the city, and his family was admired by all. Chief Kanu was truly fortunate to have a very beautiful wife named Oyibo and 3 wonderful children. Among these children, only one was a boy, and his name was Nnamdi. Chief Kanu and his wife loved their children dearly and took excellent care of them. Oyibo had a special bond with Nnamdi, her only son. She loved him so much that she often spoiled him, treating him like he was still a little baby. Even as he grew older, she had a special nickname for him, Nnam, and everyone could see that Nnamdi was growing into a real mommy's boy. Chief Kanu, on the other hand, was not happy with how Oyibo was raising their son. He believed that Nnamdi needed to learn how to be independent and responsible. He often tried to talk to his wife Oyibo about it, saying things like, "The way you are raising this boy is very bad. He's our only son and needs to learn how to be independent. With this kind of training, how can he be responsible enough to take responsibility?" Chief Kanu was worried that if Nnamdi continued to be pampered, he will not be able to handle the challenges of life on his own. Despite Chief Kanu's efforts to caution her, Oyibo never listened to him. She continued to shower Nnamdi with lots of love and attention, believing that as her only son, he deserved to be treated with extra care and affection. At the age of 10, Nnamdi was still being treated like a little baby by his mother Oyibo. She would even feed him spoon by spoon as he sat comfortably on her lap while they exchanged laughter and watched TV together in the cozy living room. Everything about Nnamdi's life seemed to revolve around his mother. If he needed anything, he would call out, "Mommy this" or "Mommy that." His whole world was centered on Oyibo, and she loved every minute of it. Nnamdi's 2 older sisters didn't mind the special treatment their brother received. They had everything they wanted and were happy with their own lives. They didn't feel jealous or upset that their brother was getting so much attention. They understood that since Nnamdi was the youngest in the family, their mother had a soft spot for him and wanted to pamper him. One day, when Nnamdi was 13 years old, he came back from school with tears streaming down his face. He was crying loudly, and his mother Oyibo immediately rushed out of her room as soon as she heard his distressed voice. She was very worried and asked, "My son, what is wrong with you?" Through his sobs, Nnamdi replied, "It's a boy in my class. He slapped me." Oyibo's face turned red with anger as she repeated, "A boy slapped you at school?" Nnam? She could hardly believe what she was hearing. Her beloved son had been hurt, and she was furious. "What did you do then?" she asked, her voice trembling with both anger and concern. Nnamdi sniffled and said, "I told him that I would report to my mother." Oyibo's anger only grew. "They will see me tomorrow in that school. It's like they don't know whose son you are," she threatened, determined to defend her son and teach those boys a lesson. When Chief Kanu returned home that evening and heard about the incident from Oyibo, he was furious, but his anger was directed not at the boy who had slapped Nnamdi, but at his wife and son. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You see what I've been telling you," he said sternly. "A boy of 13 cannot take care of himself. He can't even defend himself. His classmates slapped him, and all he could do was cry and run home to report to you. You better stop this before you ruin this child's life. Let him learn to stand up for himself." Despite Chief Kanu's warning, Oyibo was determined to protect her son. The next day, she marched to the school ready to confront the boy who had slapped Nnamdi. She caused a big scene, yelling and demanding to see the boy. The teachers all rushed out, trying to calm her down and pleading with her to let them handle the situation. This incident was just one of many that showed how much Nnamdi relied on his mother. As he grew up, he continued to depend on Oyibo to fight his battles and make important decisions for him. He never learned to stand up for himself because his mother was always there to do it for him. Nnamdi became known as a mommy's boy, and everyone knew that he couldn't make a move without his mother's guidance and support. His father, Chief Kanu, remained worried about his son's future, fearing that Oyibo's overprotectiveness would prevent Nnamdi from becoming a strong and independent man. However, Oyibo's love for Nnamdi was so strong that she couldn't help but shield him from the world, even if it meant he would never learn to face challenges on his own. Many years went by, and Nnamdi grew into a fine young man. He was not only very handsome, but also intelligent, and his father trusted him enough to let him manage one of the family's companies. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. Nnamdi was successful, kind-hearted, and admired by many. However, there was one problem that lingered. His mother, Oyibo, still refused to let him live his life on his own. She always found a way to control his decisions, no matter how old he got. Nnamdi was a real catch. He had a soft and gentle nature that made him very popular among the girls. They were drawn to his good looks and kind heart, but Oyibo never liked any of them. Whenever Nnamdi brought a girl home or talked about someone he was interested in, Oyibo would shake her head and say, "You see this one? She's only after your money. By the time she finishes it, she will leave you. Women are not to be trusted." Nnamdi, who had always believed everything his mother told him, would nod and agree, pushing away any potential relationship. He trusted his mother's judgment completely, even if it meant staying alone. This behavior began to worry the entire family. Nnamdi's sisters, who loved him dearly, were especially concerned. They often talked to their mother saying, "Nnamdi is a full-grown man now. Stop treating him like a child. Choosing a life partner is a very important decision. Let him make his own choice." But no matter how much they tried to reason with her, Oyibo's mind was set. She could not bear the thought of her baby boy making such a big decision without her input. In her eyes, no woman was good enough for her son, and she was determined to protect him from what she believed were gold diggers and untrustworthy women. This overprotectiveness created a tense atmosphere in the family. Chief Kanu, who had always been concerned about Nnamdi's independence, watched helplessly as their son continued to be coddled. He saw how Nnamdi's potential relationships were sabotaged by Oyibo's constant interferences and felt frustrated that his son couldn't see beyond his mother's warning. One sunny afternoon, Nnamdi decided to go to a restaurant for lunch. As he walked in, his eyes fell upon a very beautiful girl. Her name was Yimisi, and from the moment he saw her, Nnamdi was completely captivated. Her bright smile, the graceful way she moved, and her calm and gentle nature made him feel an overwhelming happiness he had never experienced before. He was so shy and nervous around her that he couldn't even muster the courage to tell her how he felt. Instead, he found himself returning to the restaurant every single day just to catch a glimpse of her beautiful face. Nnamdi would sit at his usual table, his heart racing every time Yimisi passed by. He admired her from a distance, smiling shyly whenever their eyes met. Yimisi soon noticed this handsome young man who seemed to be enchanted by her. She found his quiet admiration sweet and wondered why he hadn't spoken to her yet. He had such a kind face, and his gentle demeanor intrigued her. One afternoon, Yimisi decided to take the first step. During a lull in her busy shift, she walked over to Nnamdi's table with a friendly smile. "Hi there," she said, her voice as warm as her smile. "I've noticed you come here often. Is there something special about this place?" Nnamdi's heart skipped a beat. He could hardly believe Yimisi was talking to him. Gathering his courage, he smiled back and replied, "Yes, there is something very special about this place. It's you." Yimisi laughed softly, her eyes sparkling. Their conversation was brief because she had to get back to work. But in those few moments, Nnamdi felt happier than he had in a very long time. Before she left, Nnamdi quickly said, "Would it be okay if I picked you up after work? I would love to talk more." Yimisi smiled and nodded. "Sure, I would like that." Nnamdi couldn't contain his excitement. He had finally spoken to the girl who had captured his heart, and she had agreed to see him after work. All day long, Nnamdi felt like he was walking on air. He could hardly wait for the evening to come. When the time finally arrived, he stood outside the restaurant, nervously checking his watch and hoping he wouldn't mess up. When Yimisi appeared, looking even more beautiful than he had remembered, she was no longer putting on the apron, and he could now see her curves and everything. Nnamdi's heart swelled with joy. Yimisi knew just how to keep the conversation lively and could always make Nnamdi laugh. As they rode home together, she shared interesting stories about their workplace that had him chuckling non-stop. One story in particular amused him. One day, Yimisi began with a twinkle in her eye. A very neatly dressed man came into our restaurant to eat. He looked so clean and well-shaven, like he was someone important. He kept on ordering food, meal after meal, and each meal he ordered was eaten up so quickly that I was even imagining if he was with someone that was invincible. Our manager started to get worried and told us to stop serving him more food until he paid for what he had already eaten. Nnamdi listened intently, completely engrossed in the story. Yimisi continued. When I went to the young man to tell him this, he fled up and angrily stood up to leave. That was when I noticed something strange under the table. He had a big sack with him, and he had been pouring all the food into it. And you know what else I noticed? She paused, looking at Nnamdi with a mischievous grin. No. What? Nnamdi asked, his curiosity piqued. He wasn't wearing his shoes properly, and his trousers were tied around his waist with a rope. Nnamdi's eyes widened in surprise. A madman, he exclaimed. Exactly, Yimisi confirmed, and they both burst into laughter, the sound filling the car. It was a long ride home, but every minute of it was filled with joy and laughter. Yimisi was so much fun to be with, and Nnamdi felt happier than he had in a long time. As they continued their journey, Yimisi kept the stories coming, each one more entertaining than the last. Nnamdi realized that she had a wonderful way of seeing humor in everyday situations, and her laughter was infectious. By the time they reached Yimisi's home, Nnamdi felt like he had known her forever. He walked out to the door, feeling a sense of contentment and excitement for what the future might hold. Thank you for tonight, Yimisi. I haven't laughed this much in a long time, Nnamdi said, smiling warmly at her. Thank you, Nnamdi. I had a great time too. Let's do this again soon, Yimisi replied, her eyes sparkling. As Nnamdi drove home, he couldn't stop smiling. Meeting Yimisi had brought a new light into his life, and he felt a sense of happiness and freedom he had never experienced before. She had a way of making everything seem brighter and more enjoyable. Nnamdi knew that this was just the beginning of something very special. With Yimisi by his side, he felt ready to face whatever challenges came his way, knowing that laughter and love would guide him through. As the weeks went by, Nnamdi and Yimisi's friendship grew deeper and blossomed into a sweet romance. Every day after work, Nnamdi would drive Yimisi home, but their time together didn't end there. They would talk on the phone late into the night, sharing stories, dreams, and secrets. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, and they never ran out of things to say. They were so in love with each other, and it felt like they had known each other forever. At work, Nnamdi couldn't help but show his affection for Yimisi. He would send her beautiful and expensive gifts, surprising her with things like elegant jewelry, lovely dresses, and fragrant flowers. Yimisi was always delighted by his thoughtfulness and generosity. She felt truly cherished and appreciated by Nnamdi, which made their bond even stronger. During the weekends, when Yimisi had a break from work, Nnamdi would take her out on wonderful dates. They both loved the beach, so they often spent their weekends there. They would walk along the sandy shore, hand in hand, feeling the gentle breeze on their faces and listening to the soothing sounds of the waves crashing against the shore. They played in the water, splashing and laughing like carefree children. When they grew tired, they would sit together on the beach, watching the beautiful river flow and talking about their future. Yimisi had a way of making everything seem more vibrant and full of life. Her laughter was infectious, and her smile could brighten even the gloomiest days. Nnamdi found immense joy in her company and felt a deep sense of peace whenever they were together. He knew in his heart that Yimisi was the one he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. She made him incredibly happy, and he couldn't imagine his life without her. One evening, during a lively family dinner, Nnamdi decided it was a perfect time to share some exciting news with his parents. As they sat around the table, enjoying their meal, he took a deep breath and began. Mom, Dad, I have something important to tell you. I found a woman I love, and I think I want to marry her. Oyibo, his mother, almost choked on her food. Her eyes widened in shock as she sputtered. What? You are what? Wait, who is she? Before Nnamdi could respond, his father, Chief Kanu, interrupted gently. Sweetheart, you should be happy for him. I'm glad our son has finally grown up and is taking responsibility for his life. But Oyibo was not convinced. Nnamdi is still a child, she protested. You know how these Lagos girls are. They are opportunists, always wanting to take advantage of others. We can't just let him marry anyone. Besides, he's our only son. Mama, please relax, Nnamdi said, trying to calm his mother down. You should meet her. She's beautiful and kind, and she worked very hard. She's not like the Lagos girls you talk about, and she has never asked me for anything. She makes me so happy. Oyibo's eyes narrowed as she listened to her son. Can you hear him? She said, looking at her husband. He sounds like someone under a spell. Does she make you happier than your own mother? She exclaimed. Oh my God, what has this girl done to my son? Tears welled up in her eyes as she struggled to accept that her beloved Nnamdi could be so deeply affected by another woman. Despite her shock and worry, Oyibo realized that she needed to meet this girl who had captured her son's heart. After a moment of tense silence, she sighed and finally said, All right, Nnamdi, invite her over to spend the weekend with us. I need to see if she's good enough for my beloved son. Nnamdi was relieved that his parents were willing to meet Yimisi, even though he knew it would be a challenging encounter. He couldn't wait for them to see how wonderful she was and to understand why he loved her so much. When Nnamdi shared the exciting news with Yimisi, her face lit up with joy. She felt an overwhelming sense of happiness knowing that Nnamdi wanted to take their relationship to the next level. However, a flicker of doubt crossed her mind, and she couldn't help but ask, But babe, isn't it too soon? Nnamdi gently took her hands in his and looked into her eyes with sincerity. No, Yimisi, he said firmly. I'm very sure of you. I love you so much and can't imagine my life with you. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. You don't need to worry about anything. My parents are going to love you just as much as I do. Reassured by his words, Yimisi agreed to visit Nnamdi's parents on a weekend when she was free. Although she was excited, she couldn't shake off the nervousness that crept into her thoughts. As the weekend approached, Yimisi began to prepare herself for the big day. She carefully chose her outfits, wanting to make a good impression, and thought about what she would say to Nnamdi's parents. Despite Nnamdi's reassurance, Yimisi couldn't help but feel anxious. She started to have cold feet, her mind racing with all the things that could possibly go wrong. She wondered what would happen if his parents didn't like her, or if they had different expectations for the woman their son would marry. The more she thought about it, the more her worries grew. To calm herself, Yimisi took a deep breath and tried to focus on what really matters. Even if they don't like me, she told herself softly, the fact that Nnamdi loves me is enough. She knew how much Nnamdi cared for her, and that gave her strength. She reminded herself that their love was strong and genuine, and that was truly what mattered. As the day of the visit drew closely, Yimisi continued to prepare mentally and emotionally. She practiced smiling in the mirror, imagining how she would greet Nnamdi's parents. She rehearsed polite answers to questions they might ask and thought about topics she could bring up to show her interest in getting to know them. Even though her nerves were still there, Yimisi knew she had to be brave. She kept telling herself that everything would be okay, as long as she stayed true to who she was. She believed that Nnamdi's parents would see the love she had for their son, and that would be enough to win them over. Finally, the long-awaited day arrived. Yimisi had been both excited and nervous, but nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to see. As Nnamdi drove into his family's compound, Yimisi's eyes widened in disbelief. The house that stood before her was more magnificent than anything she had ever seen. It was enormous, elegant, with a beautifully landscaped gardens and towering pillars that made it look like a palace. She could hardly believe her eyes and found herself staring in awe at the stunning sights before her. The house was so breathtaking that she couldn't get enough of its view. Every detail, from the grand entrance to the polished windows, spoke of wealth and sophistication. As they pulled up to the front of the house, Yimisi noticed a woman standing in the doorway, watching them intently. It was Oyibo, Nnamdi's mother. Although Chief Kanu was not home, Oyibo had been waiting for their arrival. As she watched Yimisi step out of the car and look around, Oyibo's heart filled with bitterness. She couldn't shake the suspicion she had about this girl. Her son was so taken with. "Look at her," she murmured under her breath, her eyes narrowing. "See the way she's gawking at everything. Gold digger," she hissed, her mind filled with mistrust. When Nnamdi placed a comforting hand over Yemisi's shoulder, Oyibo's heart tightened with jealousy and anger. The sight of her son showing such affection to another woman was almost too much for her to bear. She could feel her chest tightening with each step they took towards the house. Yimisi, unaware of the brewing storm in Oyibo's heart, turned to Nnamdi as they approached the door and whispered, "Your mom is so beautiful." She was trying to make a good impression to ease the tension she felt growing inside her. When they reached the doorway, Yimisi smiled warmly and said, "Good afternoon, ma," in a respectful tone. But Oyibo barely acknowledged her greeting. She gave a cold, indifferent nod before turning on her heels and heading back into the house without a word. Yemisi's heart sank. A wave of sadness and doubt washed over her as she stood there, feeling suddenly small and out of place in this grand home. "What's wrong with your mom?" she asked Nnamdi quietly, her voice tinged with worry. "She doesn't like me, does she?" Nnamdi, noticing the sadness in her eyes, gently squeezed her shoulder and said reassuredly, "Don't worry, she will come around when she gets to know you." He tried to comfort her, but Yemisi couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest. She wanted so much for this meeting to go well, but Oyibo's icy reception left her feeling unwelcome. Though she wasn't entirely comfortable, Yemisi nodded, trying to push aside her doubts. She followed Nnamdi inside, hoping that things would improve as they went on. As they walked through the house, Yemisi couldn't help but admire the luxurious interior. Everything was so tastefully decorated with rich fabrics, elegant furniture, and beautiful artwork on the walls. When they finally reached Nnamdi's room, Yemisi was amazed by how spacious and beautifully designed it was. The room was filled with soft, inviting colors and had large windows that let in plenty of natural lights. "I love your room," she said, looking around in admiration. "It's so beautiful." Nnamdi smiled, happy to see her appreciating his home. But he knew that the real challenge was just beginning. He hoped that his mother would give Yemisi a chance and see the wonderful person he had fallen in love with. For now, all he could do was try to make Yemisi feel as comfortable as possible and hope that his mother's heart would soften in time. They both sat together, chatting and laughing loudly, enjoying each other's company. The sound of their laughter echoed through the house, reaching Oyibo's ears from her room. Each burst of laughter only deepened her anger. She had noticed the way Nnamdi looked at Yemisi, with eyes full of affection. It felt like a knife to her throat. Who does she think she is? Oyibo thought bitterly. The idea that someone could come between her and her beloved son was unbearable. Finally, she could take it no more. She stormed out of the room, fury boiling inside her, and marched straight to the door of Nnamdi's room. Without bothering to knock, she flung the door open. "Dinner has to be made," Oyibo ordered sharply. her voice cutting through the light-hearted atmosphere like a blade. She paused for a moment, glaring at Yimisi. "What's that your name again?" she demanded. "Yimisi," she replied calmly, trying to keep her composure. "Good," Oyibo snapped. "I need to see if you are worthy of marrying my son. Go to the kitchen and prepare dinner for the family." "But Mama," Nnamdi protested, surprised by his mother's harsh demand. "We have cooks in this house. Why should Yimisi be the one to cook?" "Will you shut up?" Oyibo scolded him fiercely. "What do you know?" "It's fine," Yimisi interjected, trying to ease the tension. "I will cook." "Good," Oyibo said, with a sharp note before turning and leaving the room, satisfied that she had made her point. Yimisi headed to the kitchen with Nnamdi by her side, trying to stay positive despite the uncomfortable situation. As they chatted and laughed together in the kitchen, Yimisi prepared a pot of jollof rice and chicken. The aroma filled the kitchen and everything seemed to be going well. Nnamdi tasted the food and assured her that it was delicious. They both left the kitchen, feeling confident and hopeful that dinner would be a success. Later that evening, when Chief Kanu returned home, he was delighted to finally meet Yimisi. He was immediately taken by her beauty and warm personality, and he welcomed her with open arms. As the family sat down to eat, the maid served the food, which looked as appetizing as it smelled. Everything seemed perfect, until they took the first bite. Chief Kanu scooped a spoonful of jollof rice into his mouth, but as soon as he tasted it, he spat it out with a loud exclamation. "What is this?" he shouted, his face twisted in disgust. "Oh my God," Oyibo exclaimed, quickly offering him a glass of water. The room fell into a tense silence as Yimisi and Nnamdi exchanged shocked glances. "You see the witch you brought into our home," Oyibo fired at Nnamdi, her voice dripping with venom. "She wants to kill us. She can't even cook a simple pot of jollof rice. What a disgrace." "But Mama," Yimisi began, trying to defend herself. "The food was okay when I tasted it." "Will you shut up?" Oyibo barked, her anger now fully unleashed. "Who is your mama? Do I look like a miserable mother who didn't raise you properly?" Yimisi felt like her world was collapsing around her. She had tried so hard to make a good impression, but now everything was falling apart. Her heart ached as she looked at Nnamdi, hoping he would speak up for her. "Nnamdi, you tasted the food and you said it was okay. Why are you not saying anything now?" she pleaded, her voice trembling with emotion. But before Nnamdi could respond, Oyibo cut him off, her voice cold and unyielding. "You want to know why? Because you've bewitched him. But you can't charm me or my husband. You are bad for my son." At this point, Yimisi could take it no more. Tears welled up in her eyes as she bolted from the living room, overwhelmed by the humiliation and anger she felt. Nnamdi started to follow her, but his mother's stern voice stopped him on his tracks. "Sit down," she commanded. Chief Kanu, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing frustration, finally spoke up, his voice filled with anger. "Oyibo, I don't know what has gotten into you," he scolded. "It's just a bit of salt. Anyone can make a mistake." "How many more mistakes is she going to make, Chief?" Oyibo shot back. "My son can't marry just anyone. You've seen for yourself, she can't even cook a simple meal." "But Mama, that's not going to be a problem," Nnamdi tried to reason. "We can afford to have cooks." "Look at you," Oyibo sneered. "I didn't raise you to be foolish. I don't want that girl for you, and that's on period." Chief Kanu stood up, his patience at its end. He looked at Nnamdi with a mixture of sympathy and resolve. "Nnamdi," he said firmly, "the only thing I will tell you is to follow your heart. Don't let your mother decide who you should be with. We can't judge Yimisi based on one small mistake." With that, Chief Kanu turned and left the room, leaving Nnamdi torn between his love for Yimisi and his loyalty to his mother. The evening that had begun with such high hopes had ended in bitter disappointments, and Nnamdi knew that the path ahead would be anything but easy. Yimisi was in the bathroom when Nnamdi entered his room. As soon as he heard her soft sobs, his heart shattered. He approached the door, his voice filled with regret. "I'm so sorry," he said gently. "My mother isn't used to sharing me with anyone, but she'll get used to you, I promise." Yemisi's tears didn't stop. "I'm leaving here first thing tomorrow," she said, her voice trembling with pain. "You know, my problem isn't just with your mother. It's the fact that you sat there and didn't say a single word. You watched your mother insult me and my own mother, and you did nothing. I'm done with this relationship. Your mother can have you and she can marry you too." Nnamdi felt a pang in his chest, but all he could manage to say was, "But the food was salty." Yemisi turned to him, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Disbelief etched across her face. "I can't believe you are still trying to defend her. After everything she said to me out there. I'm sure she added the salt to the food herself. Even if my mother didn't raise me well, I work at one of the biggest eateries in this city. At least, my job should have taught me something." Nnamdi's anger flared up suddenly. "You dare not accuse my mother," he thundered, his voice echoing through the room. Yemisi looked at him with a bitter smile. "Wow, so you can speak after all." "I've been so foolish," she said, shaking her head. "I promise you one thing. Your mother, she's going to ruin your life." Nnamdi stormed out of the room, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and frustration. Why was everyone saying the same thing? His father had just told him those exact words, and now Yemisi was repeating them. He loved Yemisi deeply, but he was torn between his love for her and his loyalty to his mother. Oyibo had a powerful hold on him, one he couldn't seem to break free from. The next morning, as Yemisi packed her things to leave, Nnamdi pleaded with her to stay. He begged her to give him another chance, but she remained resolute. His mother, Oyibo, watched the scene with thinly veiled satisfaction. "Let her go," she said, clapping her hands together in triumph. "Her plans have failed. Gold digger, let her go." Nnamdi watched helplessly as Yemisi walked away. He wanted to chase after her, to make things right, but his mother stood in his way, her presence like an impenetrable wall. That was how his relationship with Yemisi came to an abrupt end. In the days and weeks that followed, Nnamdi was consumed with sadness. He missed Yemisi terribly. Their laughter, their long conversations, and everything about her that had made him feel alive. But despite his longing for her, he never reached out. His mother had convinced him that Yemisi wasn't good enough for him, and he couldn't shake the doubts she had planted in his mind. One Saturday afternoon, his mother introduced him to someone new. "This is Adora," Oyibo said with a smile. "She's a fashion designer and has one of the biggest fashion houses in Lagos. Not a gold digger, I assure you. I bet you will love her when you get to know her. Her mother is a very good friend of mine." Adora was indeed beautiful, with a radiant smile that could light up a room. Nnamdi found himself drawn to her, and soon they began to spend more time together. Adora was charming and knew exactly how to win people over. One day, she prepared a delicious pot of bitterleaf soup. As the aroma filled the house, Oyibo's face lit up with approval. "This one will take very good care of my son," she exclaimed. "Not like that gold digger who almost poisoned our family." Whenever Adora visited, she made sure to sweep the floors, clean the house, and cook wonderful meals. Nnamdi found himself falling for her, and before long they began discussing marriage. Their wedding was an elaborate ceremony. filled with all the grandeur that Oyibo had dreamed of. She was overjoyed, convinced that her son had finally found the perfect wife. But what Oyibo didn't realize was that appearances can be deceiving, and the true nature of a person isn't always visible at first glance. Right after their wedding, Adora began to reveal a side of herself that no one had seen before. The first sign of trouble came when she refused to live in the family house. "We are married now," she told Nnamdi with a firm tone. "I can't live here with your mother. We need our own life and privacy too." Her words were not a suggestion, but a clear demand. Oyibo, who had always imagined her son living close by, was completely against this idea. She insisted that Nnamdi and Adora remain in the family house. She argued that it was tradition that the family would stay together, especially since they had such a large and comfortable home. However, Chief Kanu, always the voice of reason, surprisingly sided with Adora. "She's right," he said thoughtfully. "They should have their own space. It's time for them to start their own life together." To make the transition smooth, Chief Kanu gifted the couple a stunning duplex, a house that was both beautiful and luxurious, perfect for starting a new life together. Adora's real intentions began to unfold after they moved into their new home. She was a strong-willed woman, and she knew exactly how to manipulate Nnamdi into doing everything she wanted. She needed a space, free from Oyibo's influence, to have Nnamdi all to herself, with no one else around to interfere. She could control him completely, bending him to her will. Not long after they had settled into their new home, Oyibo decided to visit them. She wanted to see how they were doing, and perhaps she also hoped to remind them that she was still an important part of their lives. But when she arrived, she was met with a cold reception. Adora didn't even bother to hide her displeasure. She greeted Oyibo with a half-hearted murmur and returned to her couch, where she became absorbed in her phone. They sat in the living room together, but it was as if their worlds were apart. Adora didn't try to make conversation, and the silence between them was heavy and uncomfortable. Oyibo was stunned by this change in Adora. Was this really the same woman who used to treat her with such reverence, who would cook and pamper her as if she were a queen? The stark contrast was almost too much to bear. Finally, after a long awkward silence, Oyibo managed to find her voice. "I'm hungry," she said softly, hoping Adora might offer to prepare something or at least show a bit of concern. But Adora didn't even look up from her phone. She simply ignored Oyibo, pretending not to hear. When Oyibo repeated herself, this time with a bit more urgency, Adora's response was shocking. She looked up with a cold expression and snapped, "Do I look like your maid? I heard you the first time. The kitchen door is open, please use it, and don't ever order me around again." Oyibo was utterly shocked. Adora had not only refused to help her, but had also yelled at her, something she never expected. Fear crept into Oyibo's heart. She didn't know how to respond. For the first time, she was afraid to speak, worried that Adora might actually do something worse if she pushed back. Reluctantly, she stood up and walked to the kitchen, her hands trembling as she prepared a simple meal for herself. But the humiliation didn't end there. As soon as Oyibo finished cooking, Adora suddenly appeared in the kitchen without a word. She grabbed a plate and scooped out a large portion of the food, leaving barely anything in the pot. Oyibo watched helplessly, her heart sinking as she realized how powerless she had become in her own son's home. The woman who had once treated her like royalty was now treating her like trash. As she stood there staring at the almost empty pot, Oyibo felt a deep sense of loss. She had lost her son, her influence, and now even her dignity. The helplessness she felt in that moment was overwhelming, and for the first time in her life, Oyibo didn't know what to do next. When Nnamdi returned home from work that evening, Oyibo wasted no time in telling him everything that had happened while he was away. She described how Adora had treated her with such disdain, how she had been forced to cook her own meal, only to have Adora take most of it for herself. Nnamdi was furious, his anger boiled over as he listened to his mother's accounts, disbelief mixing with rage. How could Adora, the woman he married, treat his mother, his own flesh and blood, like trash? Storming into the living room where Adora was, Nnamdi's voice thundered with fury. Adora, I won't have you insult my mother in this house. This is unacceptable. But Adora was not one to back down easily. She met his anger with a cold, defiant glare. Says who? You? She retorted, her voice dripping with contempt. I decide what happens in this house. And I say she leaves tomorrow. I won't have her come here and run our lives. She should stay in her husband's house where she belongs. Nnamdi's face reddened with anger. She goes nowhere, he thundered, his voice echoing through the room. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This wasn't the woman he thought he knew. How could she speak so callously about his mother? Adora, unfazed by his outburst, simply shrugged and turned away. I won't argue with you, she said coolly. Just watch and see. With that, she stormed out of the living room, leaving Nnamdi standing there, his fist clenched and his heart pounding with frustration. Oyibo sat quietly on the sofa, watching her son. Tears welled up in her eyes and began to roll down her cheeks. She had never seen Nnamdi look so helpless, so trapped in his home. It broke her heart to see him like this, especially knowing that she was the one who had recommended Adora to him in the first place. She couldn't find the words to comfort him, couldn't even bring herself to speak, as the guilt weighed heavily on her heart. The next morning, things took a turn for the worse. True to her word, Adora didn't wait for any further discussion. As soon as the sun rose, she began throwing Oyibo's belongings out of the house, one by one. Her actions were swift and deliberate, with no trace of hesitation. Adora's face was set in a determined scowl, her eyes burning with a cold fire. There was no doubt in Oyibo's mind that Adora meant every word she had said the night before. Get out, Adora demanded, pushing Oyibo towards the door. I told you, you are not welcome here. You think I don't know who you are? I won't allow you run my husband's life anymore. Nnamdi just stood watching helplessly. Oyibo, seeing the fierce determination in Adora's eyes, knew that there was no point in arguing. She could see that Adora was serious, that this was not a bluff. The fear that had settled in her heart the day before grew stronger, and with trembling hands she picked up her bags. Without another word, she left the house that she had once hoped would be a new hope for her son and his wife. As she walked out the door, she felt a deep sadness, realizing that her presence was no longer welcome in her son's life. She hurried back to her home, her heart heavy with regret and sorrow. Chief Kanu couldn't help but laugh as Oyibo recounted her dreadful experience with Adora. His laughter was deep and hearty, which only fueled Oyibo's frustration. You know the worst part of it, she said. Nnamdi just stood there, watching helplessly. He couldn't say or do anything. Still, Chief Kanu just sat there laughing. This was becoming frustrating to her, as she couldn't understand what was so amusing about the situation. How could he find humor in something that was causing her so much pain and worry? What's so funny about this, she snapped, her anger bubbling over. Chief wiped a tear from the corner of his eye and sighed, his expression turning serious. I warned you, Oyibo, he said, shaking his head slowly. This is just the beginning. You didn't want to see it, but now you're dealing with the consequences. How do you expect Nnamdi to react or fight back when you've always fought for him all his life? That boy has become too weak for a man. I hope that girl doesn't end up killing him. I won't let her do that, Oyibo countered. Chief laughed. Let's see what you can do. As the days turned into weeks, it became painfully clear that Adora was not the angel she had appeared to be. Beneath her beautiful exterior lay a cold and selfish heart. She made Nnamdi's life a living nightmare. Every word she spoke was an order, and Nnamdi, feeling trapped, found himself obeying her every command, no matter how unreasonable. Adora refused to cook or clean for him, dismissing such tasks as beneath her. Instead, she spent her days attending parties, flirting shamelessly with other men, and coming home late at night, often drunk and ready to pick up a fight. She turned Nnamdi to her maid in his own home. The smallest conversation with Adora quickly escalated into full-blown arguments. She seemed to thrive in conflict, using every opportunity to belittle Nnamdi and remind him of her dominance in the home. Her spending habits were another source of constant stress. Adora was addicted to shopping, always needing the latest designer clothes, shoes, bags, and accessories. She spared no expense, draining Nnamdi's finances with her extravagant lifestyle, as they both had a joint account. Nnamdi's frustration reached its peak. The man who had once been full of joy and laughter now felt like a shell of his former self. He couldn't believe how drastically his life has changed since marrying Adora. In desperation, he turned to his mother for help. He confided in Oyibo, telling her about the endless fights, the reckless spending, and the cold, loveless atmosphere in his home. He begged her to talk some sense into Adora, hoping that his mother's influence might change things. I'm losing my mind, mother, he pleaded. Oyibo, despite her own feelings of anger and betrayal, agreed to try and reason with Adora. She visited her son's house, determined to set things right, but Adora had no intention of listening to anything Oyibo had to say. Instead, she met her mother-in-law's attempt at peace with hostility. She insulted Oyibo in ways that left her reeling, treating her with utter disrespect. When Oyibo tried to stand her ground, Adora physically pushed her and carried her out of the house, slamming the door in her face. The humiliation didn't stop there. Adora took things a step further by warning the gateman never to allow Oyibo into the house again. If you let that woman in here, she threatened, you will lose your job. She's not welcomed into my home anymore. The message was clear. Adora had complete control over Nnamdi's life, and there was no room for anyone else, not even his own mother. Nnamdi was devastated. The one person he thought could help him had been brutally cast out, and he was left to face Adora's wrath. The weight of his decision to marry her pressed down on him like a heavy burden. He realized too late that the woman he thought he loved was destroying everything he held dear. His home, his peace, and his relationship with his family were all in shambles, and there seemed to be no way out. Chief's once lively and joyful home had turned into a place filled with sorrow and despair. Nnamdi found himself trapped in a life that was nothing like he had imagined. Adora, the woman he married with so much hope, had proven to be nothing more than a gold digger. It became painfully clear that she had only married him to squander his money. All the grand stories about her owning a successful fashion house in the city had been nothing but lies. Adora had nothing. Nnamdi felt caged in his home, a prisoner to Adora's manipulation and deceit. As the days dragged on, Nnamdi's thoughts began to drift back to Yimisi. It had been over a year since he had last spoken to her, and the distance weighed heavily on his heart. He couldn't help but imagine the life he could have had with her, the happiness they shared, the love that had once filled his days. He realized now, with deep regret, that he had made a terrible mistake in letting her go. Yimisi had been right all along, and her final words to him echoed in his mind like a haunting reminder. I promise you, your mother will ruin your life. Those words were truer than he could have ever imagined. Nnamdi was now living in the very nightmare Yimisi had predicted. His life had become a mess, and he was the one caught in the middle of it all. The dreams he had once held for his future were shattered, replaced by the harsh reality of his current situation. Life with Adora was unbearable. There was no love, no peace, only constant turmoil and regret. Nnamdi's heart ached as he thought about how different things could have been if he had chosen differently and stood up for himself as a man. If only he had listened to his own heart, instead of letting his mother's fears and control dictate his choices. The realization that he had allowed himself to be manipulated into this situation was almost too much to bear. One day, Nnamdi was sitting in his office going through some paperwork when his phone buzzed. It was a notification from his bank, and when he opened it, his heart nearly stopped. A huge debit alert flashed on the screen. All the money in his account had been withdrawn. Panic surged through him as he realized what had happened. The only person who had access to his account was Adora, his wife. Without a second thought, Nnamdi leaped up from his chair and rushed out of his office, nearly running someone over in his frantic haste to get home and confront her. As he sped through the streets, his mind raced with questions. Why would Adora do this? What was she thinking? But when he finally reached their home and burst through the door, he was met with silence. The house was eerily empty. Adora was gone, and so were all of her belongings. She had packed up everything and vanished without a trace. The realization hit Nnamdi like a ton of bricks. Adora had not only drained his bank account, but also left him, disappearing without a word. Broken and in despair, Nnamdi didn't know what to do next. A few days later, just when he thought things couldn't get any worse, a group of men showed up at the house. They were carrying original documents and claimed that Adora had sold the house to them. Nnamdi was stunned, unable to comprehend how everything had fallen apart so quickly. His entire world had crumbled in a matter of days. Tears filled his eyes as he realized he had lost everything. His money, his home, and the life he had built. With nowhere else to turn, Nnamdi drove back to his parents' house, tears streaming down his face. He felt defeated, stripped of everything he once had. He would have to start his life over from scratch, and the weight of that really was almost too much to bear. All attempts to contact Adora's family led nowhere. They claimed not to know where she was, and no one had seen her since she left. Eventually, Nnamdi discovered the painful truth. Adora had run away with her lover, leaving him to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. Chief Kanu, though saddened by his son's suffering, couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. He had warned them both, his wife and his son, that Adora was trouble. And with the way his wife ran Nnamdi's life, it was obvious that she was going to ruin it. And she successfully had. Now, both mother and son had learned the hard way that not everyone could be trusted, and that sometimes the people you let into your life can destroy it. A few weeks later, Nnamdi decided that he couldn't let his life end in this despair. He thought of Yimisi, the woman he had foolishly let go, and realized that she was the only one who had ever truly made him happy. He knew he had made terrible mistakes, but he was determined to make things right. Nnamdi resolved to find Yimisi and convince her that he was a changed man. and that he had learned his lesson and was ready to start over again with her. He waited until he was sure Yimisi had finished work before driving to her workplace. As he sat in his car, nerves and regrets gnawed at him, but he knew he had to do this. Finally, he saw her walking out of the eatery, looking just as beautiful as he remembered. Summoning all his courage, Nnamdi quickly got out of the car and approached her. "Please, Yimisi," he begged, dropping on his knees before her. "I'm so sorry. I've learned my lesson and I want you back in my life. I was wrong and I regret ever listening to my mother. Please give me another chance." Yimisi looked down at him, a mixture of surprise and amusement in her eyes. Then she let out a laugh. "Wow," she exclaimed. "It took you over a year to realize that you needed me in your life." "What? Is your mother dead or something?" Her words stung, but Nnamdi couldn't blame her. He knew he deserved every bit of her scorn. "Please, Yimisi," he pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "I regret everything. I'm so sorry." But before he could say anything more, a voice interrupted them. "Hey babe, let's go. Who's this?" Nnamdi looked up to see a tall, handsome man walking towards them. He watched in agony as Yimisi smiled and walked over to the man, wrapping her arms around him. "He's nobody, just a weak mommy's boy," she said, mocking him. They both exchanged a brief tender kiss, and in that moment, Nnamdi felt like the world was collapsing around him. The realization hit him hard. Yimisi had moved on, and he had lost her for good. Crushed and defeated, Nnamdi picked himself up and walked back to his car, his eyes filled with tears. As he drove back to his parents' house, he felt the full weight of his mistakes bearing down on him. He had learned his lessons the hard way, and the pain of that lesson would stay with him forever. Nnamdi knew now that he would never again let anyone, not even his mother, control his life. But that knowledge came too late to save what he had lost. Hey besties, thank you for watching this amazing story, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed making it. I would like you to share your lessons in the comment section, and don't forget to tell us where you are watching from. Thank you for all your love and support. And if you are yet to subscribe to this channel, please do not skip this video without hitting the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so that you get notified whenever we post new stories. Thank you for all your amazing comments and encouragement. They mean so much to me, and I can't even thank you enough for it. Right now, I'll have to go and see you in our next story. Bye!